Chapter 4, Don't Be So Unlikable. One night in Hollywood, a few years after film school, I hopped in the car with two former classmates, Jason Ensler and Jay Lowy, and Jay's girlfriend, Courtney. It was Friday night, we were headed to a party in the Hollywood Hills, and all of us were feeling optimistic at the end of a good week. Jason was being considered as a director of a television show, Jay was up to direct a movie, and I had a feature script that several companies were thinking about optioning. With a big smile, I said from the front passenger seat, "You know, by Monday afternoon, we could all be major players in Hollywood." Before anyone could agree, Courtney spoke up from the back seat. "Now listen," she said hesitantly. "I don't mean to be, how shall I say this, the Randy of this group, but I think the odds of that happening are awfully slim." The car was silent for a moment as we processed this, then everyone burst out laughing and continued laughing for the rest of the night as a new expression was born that we still use to this day. Whenever someone is deluding themselves with excessive optimism and losing touch with the cold scientific facts of the real world, somebody invariably chimes in, "Now listen, I don't mean to be the Randy of this group, but..." Section heading, Like a Completely Dreamless Sleep. It's time to add up everything we've been through so far and consider how it affects the most important variable, whether the people in the audience like what they're hearing. You can avoid the pitfalls of the first 3 chapters, be not so cerebral, be not so literal-minded, and tell a good story, but if there's something about you that people don't like, you're still not going to communicate very effectively. So let's begin by examining the unique aspects of the scientist persona. A fun piece of knowledge for marine biologists is that the great American novelist John Steinbeck spent much of his life probing the interface between science and society. Though he was a man of letters, his very best friend in life was a scientist, Ed Doc Ricketts, a marine biologist. Ricketts not only fascinated Steinbeck, but is also believed to have been the inspiration for, and at times the source of, much of the author's deepest and most contemplative writings. Some biographers of Steinbeck have even hinted that at one point, when he was most fed up with the viciousness of literary critics and the superficiality of the world of fame that engulfed him, Steinbeck toyed with the notion of chucking it all and going off to study sea creatures full-time with his marine biologist buddy. When Ed Ricketts died in 1948 in a car-train collision, Steinbeck was jolted and said, "He was part of my brain for 18 years." In 1940, at the height of their friendship, but in what some believe was Steinbeck's winter of his own discontent, he took a sea journey with Ricketts. Steinbeck's second marriage was unraveling. Ricketts was trying to escape a failing relationship of his own. The planet was on the brink of World War, and the two men sought a spiritual escape through the ocean. The book Steinbeck wrote upon his return, much of it cribbed from Ricketts' journal, The Log from the Sea of Cortez, is considered by many to contain some of Steinbeck's most complex and sophisticated writing. In one of my favorite passages, so relevant to the persona of a scientist, Steinbeck recounts the story of Jimmy Costello, a Monterey news reporter, who was called to the beach one day on the news that a, quote, sea serpent had washed ashore. A wave of excitement had swept the town. Jimmy managed to find the creature in the assembled mob on the beach. Steinbeck wrote, "He rushed, approaching the evil-smelling monster from which the flesh was dropping. There was a note pinned to its head which said, quote, 'Don't worry about it, it's a basking shark.' Signed by Dr. Ralph Boland of the Hopkins Marine Station. No doubt that Dr. Boland had acted kindly, for he loves true things, but the kindness was a blow to the people of Monterey. They so wanted it to be a sea serpent. Even we hoped it would be. When sometime a true sea serpent, complete and undecayed, is found or caught, a shout of triumph will go through the world. Quote, 'There you see,' men will say. 'I knew they were there all the time. I just had a feeling they were there.' Men really need sea monsters in their personal seas, and the old man in the sea is one of these." Steinbeck goes on to describe the mythical old man of the sea and then comes back around. "For the ocean, deep and black in the depths, is like the low dark levels of our mind in which the dream symbols incubate and sometimes rise up to sight like the old man of the sea. And even if the symbol vision be horrible, it is there and it is ours. An ocean without its unnamed monsters would be like a completely dreamless sleep." Let's take a moment and savor the beauty of what Steinbeck meant. It's the downside of scientific thinking, the evisceration of all that is mystical, alluring, mesmerizing, and elusive about life. It's the snapping on of the light in the dark room where the imagination is running wild, only to shed the light of science and reveal that no, there really isn't anything too crazy going on in here. It's just a basking shark. No need to indulge your fantasies. Had my friend Courtney been there, she would have told Ralph Boland to word his message as, quote, "Now look, I don't mean to be the Randy of this group, but there are no sea serpents, and this thing is just a basking shark, and we've all seen those 1,000 times before." And the whole crowd of townspeople would have taken this in, looked at one another for a moment, and shouted back at Boland, "Oh, don't be such a scientist!" Then they would have gone back to calling it a sea serpent. This, once again, is representative of the standard psyche and public presentation of the scientist. It's a negating role. The designated driver, remaining sober amid the fantasy-blinded townspeople. Truth teller is a valiant role, and I am in no way saying scientists shouldn't play it. When the spread of sexually transmitted diseases can be prevented by the use of condoms, we certainly don't want scientists to hesitate in advocating them simply to avoid spoiling the romance of sex. But in the end, it's just not a very likable trait. Nobody likes a party pooper. So the question is whether there are ways to play the scientist role without being the negating, annoying, no-fun voice. Essentially, is it possible to be the scientist and still be liked? That is the focus of this most important chapter. Section heading, Rising Above. Before I get into the more positive side of things and address the subject of being likable, let me begin with the inverse, how to be unlikable, and what the consequences are. It's time to go back to that acting class that so thoroughly spun my head around. Yet another basic principle was ground into us night after night. All else being equal, audiences do not like characters who, quote, rise above. To rise above is to condescend, to talk down, to be arrogant, to act superior, all of those things. They are unlikable traits the audience no likey. To see this up close and personal, we did exercises in which we acted out two different approaches to the same problem. The first involved rising above, the second didn't. So again, we're back in the acting class, this time with two students playing a husband and wife at home. The husband has just discovered that his wife stole $100 from him. In version 1, he's furious. He can hardly contain his anger. He treats her in a degrading manner and calls her all sorts of terrible things. He says, "You stupid, lying, thieving tramp, you're a scumbag. Give me back my money or I'll slap you." It doesn't take long for the audience to start feeling sorry for the woman, figuring there must have been some reason for her to take the money and that he should try to be more understanding. Before you know it, it's the criminal, the wife, who has the sympathy of the audience. In version 2, the husband avoids rising above at all costs and tries to come down to the wife's level or lower. He speaks softly to her in a pleading, compassionate, understanding voice. "How could you do this? We've worked so hard to build a trusting relationship. I just don't understand. You must have had a good reason for it, since I know you would never do this without one. Still, this hurts me very deeply." In this version, the audience feels for him, turns to her and practically wants to speak for him and saying, "Yeah, you rat, how could you do this?" And she's left with the great temptation to say, "Quit your sniveling," which is, alas, rising above, and the end of her with the audience. It took me a while to really take this in and digest it. But when I did, I realized the value of this dynamic in the real world. I can tell you that since watching those exercises, I've put it to use several times in actual conflicts. The fact is, when something has gone wrong, and especially when people know they're guilty of something, they're defensive and ready to escalate immediately. All you have to do is say, "You lying thief," and the other person will shoot up higher with, "Well, who are you to talk? Remember last year when I caught you?" And the whole conflict spins out of control. But this is where you have a certain amount of control over your own destiny. If you manage to restrain yourself, you can take the confrontation in a completely different direction. And I've done it, actually surprising people who expected me to erupt in anger. Just last week, a friend caught a student cheating on an exam and asked for my advice. I said, instead of rising above and scolding the student, see what happens if you come down to his level. Make it clear you were hurt that he did it and ask why he did. Sure enough, the student ended up pouring his heart out, crying and agreeing to withdraw from the class on his own. The professor had been braced for all-out warfare and was shocked by the different outcome. In fact, my entire movie, Flock of Dodos, is one big exercise in not rising above. I interviewed people whose ideas and viewpoints I considered largely foolish and illogical, but restrained myself from belittling them. Many viewers over the years have asked, how did you keep from shouting at them? And critics complimented the film for avoiding the attacks one would expect from an evolutionist. The acting classes paid off. Rising above is a guaranteed path to conflict, which is sometimes okay, but it's important to know that it's not the only way to approach an issue. And more important, people just don't like it. Look at your typical villain. What's the most common trait for everyone from Hitler to Dr. Evil? It's the arrogance of believing they're smarter and better than the rest of the world. It's a repulsive trait, a guaranteed pathway to not being liked. Doesn't matter how smart you are, and in fact, it's characteristic of many smart people. British filmmaker Adam Curtis created an excellent documentary on the history of public relations titled The Century of the Self, which focuses in its first half on Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays. The man was a genius at mass communication, applying many of Freud's ideas to marketing and founding the profession of public relations in the 1920s. But, according to his daughter, he could also be arrogant, condescending, and hateful. In the documentary, she said, "It can be a little hard on the people around you, especially when you make other people feel stupid. The people who worked for him were stupid, and children were stupid, and if people did things in a way that he wouldn't have done them, they were stupid." It was a word he used over and over and over again. Dope and stupid. I'm afraid that's the same kind of language I heard coming out of the highly educated evolutionists in the summer of 2005, and it helped prompt me to make the movie Flock of Dodos. They called the proponents of intelligent design all sorts of names. And I thought to myself, don't they realize how they're coming off? Are they clueless about such simple interpersonal dynamics? The answer, to a large extent, was yes. Section heading. Science is, unfortunately, a negating profession. I touched on this a bit earlier in Chapter 3. Now I'll go into it in depth. The entire profession of science has at its core a single word, and that word is no. Science is a process not of affirming ideas, but of attempting to falsify ideas in the search for truth. This is what a hypothesis is, an idea that can be tested and possibly falsified and rejected. When you give a scientist a paper, he or she reads it with the assumption that the writer is guilty of being wrong until proven innocent. The writer proves his or her innocence by either presenting data or citing sources. With each statement in the paper, the scientist reading it says, "I'm not sure I believe this." As the author presents graphs and tables of data and cites sources, the good critical scientist attempts to falsify what's being said. Eventually, after the scientist has examined the data, looked up the cited sources, and found that, in fact, despite considerable effort, the hypothesis presented cannot be falsified. Only then does the scientist finally start to relax a bit and say, well, okay, I think I can probably live with this. Tough business. It really is. As I waded through my first decade of rejection in Hollywood as a filmmaker, people would ask me whether I found the rejection hurtful or depressing. And I would respond, "Are you shitting me? Do you have any idea what it's like to deal with the rejection of scientists? Hollywood folks reject things on the basis of the idea that it just didn't grab me, and they can't even articulate the reason for their decision. When scientists reject you, they hit you with a stack of data and sources that are the basis for it. That's the sort of specific, substantive rejection that truly hurts." Section heading. A critical thing called critical thinking. This negating approach gives rise to something known as critical thinking, which I believe can, to a large extent, be learned. I say this because of a wonderfully stupid experience I had as an undergraduate. I grew up as a God-loving sort of Kansas-raised young Republican imitation farm boy. The truth is I was raised in the suburbs of Kansas City, but I knew some farm boys who transferred from the University of Kansas to the University of Washington in Seattle halfway through my undergraduate career. There I fell in with a bunch of sandal-wearing, establishment-questioning, non-conforming, even though they all looked very much alike, hippie graduate students in biology. One night at a dinner party, blanketed by incense, candles, and patchouli stench, I got into an argument about politics that quickly turned into me, the frat boy from Kansas, versus them, the unwashed masses. Somebody finally interrupted me to say, "How do you know that's true?" And I very smugly and confidently shot back, "I know it's true because I read it in Reader's Digest." Well, you can imagine what happened. There wasn't the slightest trace of a smile or humor on my face. I was not joking, but the entire dinner party erupted into a screaming, howling pack of jackals rolling on the floor, peeing in their pants, slapping each other on the back as I sat there angrily shouting, What? What's so funny?" Bastards. It proved to be a moment of awakening. A voice in the back of my head asked at that moment, could it be possible that not everything written in Reader's Digest is correct? I had honestly never considered that. Don't worry, I went to graduate school at Harvard and got cured, and the world of science was the biggest part of my awakening, which convinces me you can actually learn to be a more critical thinker, because I sure was a dumb Kansas bumpkin back then. So in the beginning, when I was a junior at the University of Washington, I would read a paper for a discussion group and think, wow, what a great and exciting study. And then attend the formal discussion with the graduate students, every one of whom, as they filed into the room, would say, "This week's paper is a piece of crap." And my smile and enthusiasm would immediately wither into nods of agreement saying, yeah, it really sucked, even though I had no clue why. That was when I first began to learn the idea of reading a scientific paper with no being the starting point. 15 years later, as a professor at the University of New Hampshire, I'd bring a half dozen graduate students into my office to discuss recent research papers and realize the tables had turned. The students would come in saying, "That was an interesting paper we read this week," and I would scowl at them with a look of, "What do you mean?" Then I would tear into the paper, pulling it apart at the seams, showing them how poorly designed the hypotheses, experiments, and analyses were, and accusing the writer of presenting a discussion that was totally bogus. And on some days, they would cower and glare at me as if to say, "Dude, don't be such a scientist."